Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the fifth and final session of our first day of Zoom-A-Palooza, our first annual Zoom-A-Palooza. Again, this is in honor of our 125th anniversary here at Lincoln Memorial University. And I am your event coordinator for Zoom-A-Palooza, Dr. Stephen Atkins. I teach in the Master of Public Administration program, and I coordinate our graduate programs here at LMU, including our MPA program, our Master of Science in Criminal Justice program, and our upcoming Master of Science in Psychology program as well. So if you need any more information about those programs, please be sure to check us out at lmunet.edu. Today, we have a very special treat. We have a returning former LMU professor coming to us. This is Dr. John Grove. He is currently with the Liberty Fund, the managing editor of Law and Liberty. And he has his PhD in political science from Northern Illinois University. John is, like I said before, the managing editor of Law and Liberty, which is an online magazine on law, politics, and culture published by the Liberty Fund. Previously, he was an associate professor of political science at LMU. He's published academic work on 18th and 19th century English and American political thought, and has written for several public outlets on conservatism, constitutionalism, the early republic, and constitutional originalism. His speech today is titled Faith, Skepticism, and the Crackup of the Left and Right. John, welcome back. It's so good to see you. I'm going to give you the floor now, and you can go ahead.
Thanks a lot for that introduction. It's nice to be back virtually at LMU. I will just say up front before I do have some slides that I'll use, but before I put those up, I will just say have a quick note. Like Dr. Adkins noted, I am an ex-academic, so what I'm presenting here today is more of a long form essay for kind of public writing that I do now. It's not aimed at a peer review journal or anything like that. So might be a little bit different than some of the other presentations, but I do think it'll be something that anybody interested in political theory should hopefully find something interesting in it. At least that's my hope. So I will try to share my screen here and get my slides up. Here we go. Is this working?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay. Oh. Okay, so the title of my presentation, Faith, Skepticism, and the Crackup of the Left and the Right. I'll give a quick overview about what I mean here by the crackup and by faith and skepticism, because it's not all entirely clear. The crackup on the left and the right that I'm referring to, I'm going to use the terms the woke left and the common good right. I use these terms for simplicity because they are the terms that the public discourse tends to use. They're identifiable. I don't necessarily have any agenda or connotations in the way I'm using them. I realize lately woke has kind of become a partisan term. That's not really my intent. I'm just using it as a kind of identifier of a phenomenon on the left, and then the common good right as a phenomenon that's happening on the right, kind of pointing out some similarities between these two movements. I call it a crack up between the left and right because I think you can see more what you might call kind of more extreme wings of both the ideological left and the ideological right have become more prominent in the last 15 or 20 years in the public discourse. They're no longer kind of considered to be the fringe, but or extreme. In fact, both of them are tending to kind of drive some of the public discourse on both sides of that spectrum. So that's what I have in mind with both of these. We sometimes talk about them as kind of just the more extreme versions of the left and the right. We might sometimes call them illiberal versions of the left and the right. I think my presentation and my use of Michael Oakeshott's book that I'll talk about here in just a minute, I think suggests that there's a better way to understand exactly what's underneath these intellectual phenomena. So I'll talk more about what I mean by both of those on my next slide, but that's what I mean by the crack up, is that basically we have divisions and tensions. I might go too far when I say crack up, but at the very least there are some tensions on both the left and the right when it comes to the intellectual backing for their ideology. So I'm going to apply then this book by Michael Oakeshott called The Politics of Faith and the Politics of Skepticism. This was a book written in the 1950s, but only published after Oakeshott's death. I'll talk about Oakeshott again later. But the faith-skepticism dichotomy that Oakeshott presents is basically a way to think about what the particular function or role of government ought to be in the broader picture of human conduct. So if we're all human beings living human life with one another, what exactly should government be doing in that life, right? What is the particular role of governance in that broader picture? So I will note up front, it's not about religious faith and religious skepticism. There are some tangential connections that can be made between these two concepts, but it's not about religious faith and religious skepticism. It's about political faith and political skepticism, the way you view the state. So I'm gonna present the argument of Oakeshott's book, some basic ways I think that it can help us understand some of the intellectual movements on both the left and the right, and then I'm going to more broadly talk about how it can help us understand those things. So first, I'm going to talk about how I think the politics of faith, as Oakeshott describes it, essentially describes what both wings of the left and the right are doing, or kind of embracing a kind of version of what Oakeshott called the politics of faith. But then I'm going to talk about some more specifics about how it can help us understand some of the difficulties that we encounter in our modern political discourse. So first, I'm going to talk about our political lexicon, the vocabulary. Oakeshott's book was written specifically with this in mind. He essentially said that we can't talk politics anymore because our vocabulary has been all twisted up, because we have these two underlying frameworks, faith and skepticism, that kind of confuse our language. Then I'll talk about the activities and office of government. I think Oakeshott's book can help us kind of zero in on this question, what should government do? And see how that question is not necessarily the same question as lots of other ones that we often talk about in the same breath. So it's not the same as big government versus small government, for instance. It's not about particular policies and particular questions, but that we can isolate that question and think about it. Oakeshott argues that we're always going to be between the two poles. So one of the important things to recognize going into this discussion of politics of faith and politics of skepticism is that this is was never presented as a dichotomy between two choices, but as between two poles, two extremes that we're always going to be inclined towards one or the other at a given time, but we're never going to be at the far extreme. And then at the very end, I'm going to make a very, I think, fairly humble case for political skepticism. So before we move on, I will very quickly define political faith and skepticism. Political faith, the politics of faith, he says, is essentially the view that government aims at some sort of human perfection or inevitable improvement. That the role of government, the purpose of government is to overcome human frailty in some way. Whereas the politics of skepticism argues that government ought to aim at rules that facilitate peaceful coexistence and take society largely on its own terms. So it's between those two poles that Oakeshott argues our politics kind of goes back and forth. So with that in mind, I'll talk more about both of those, of course, as we go on. We'll talk a little bit about the crack up, or as I said, maybe I go too far in saying crack up, at the very least, the tensions that exist on the left and the right. What I have in mind when I talk about the woke left, or the more kind of extreme progressive left, is in the last 10, 15 years or so, there's been much greater emphasis on the concept of power structures and the need for comprehensive social transformation on the left. This has been influenced in a good deal by critical theory, which is another thing that I know has now kind of taken on some sort of partisan meaning. I don't have any partisan meaning or anything about school board meetings in mind here, but critical theory, right, it is a thing. It focuses attention on the extent to which every structure, every social structure, every legal structure is essentially the projection of power in some way, and it's going to be power that benefits some and not others. So critical theory generally emphasizes the need to deconstruct, right? Deconstructivism, very much associated with it, right? Deconstruct various social institutions and rebuild, rebuilding not with any sense that we're going to have a neutral public square, but rebuilding with a particular vision of social justice in mind. So a big part of this then means that individual and group behavior is not just a matter of personal choice, but every individual action, thought, speech, behavior all contributes in some way to a kind of broader social structure that can either be good or it can be bad. So individual and group behavior, thinking, and speech become legitimate objects of political action. So a way to think about this, again, reducing it to Twitter memes, is this idea: words are violence. You see this a lot more on the left more recently, that the idea that the words that are said, thoughts that are expressed, can essentially have the effect of violence, that they perpetuate certain ideas, which in turn perpetuate social structures, which have real effects on people's lives. So you can see that as a way, as one example of this kind of new left thinking. So one of the things that a theme I've kind of weaved into the presentation here is that free speech is in question then. You see a growing resistance on the left to America's historical, pretty broad protection of free speech rights. Particularly on the left, it's going to be on the matter of hate speech, right? So Europe has much more restrictive conceptions of free speech around this idea of hate speech, right? Speech that can be construed as kind of either a call to violence or a call to hatred. In some cases, in some European countries, it's simply speech that is insulting or intentionally meant to be insulting. That are not covered under free speech. In the United States, for the most part, all of that has been off the board, constitutionally speaking. But you see in the new left a kind of new opening to the idea that the United States should have more robust restrictions on free speech when it comes to hate speech. And like I said, that's going to be a familiar theme. The common good right, it's probably not talked about quite as much on broadly speaking, but it's I think the rift on the right is even more clear. The common good right is defined in large part to a turn towards what's called common good judicial philosophy. So a number of notable academics and public intellectuals, op-ed writers, and so forth have, from a conservative perspective, criticized what has long been the conservative judicial interpretation, which is essentially originalism or textualism. That is, when you interpret the law based on what the writers of that law originally meant for it to mean. That's a simplification, but that's basically what it means. The common good right has kind of challenged that and argued that it's morally empty conception, that it's just whatever somebody wrote however long ago is the law, is kind of morally empty. So a Harvard law professor named Adrian Vermeule just wrote a book last week, or published, sorry, not last week, last month, calling for a common good constitutionalism that essentially says conservatives should read moral principles into the law and make the law essentially conducive towards the common good as they understand it. So this rejection of originalism and textualism is part of the common good right. The common good right also embraces economic protectionism as opposed to free trade. Here again, the idea that government should be kind of used to promote economic outcomes that are simply better, right, as opposed to free trade that, right, well, everybody gets to trade with one another and whatever happens, happens. So the embrace of economic protectionism. In some cases, there's been an increased intellectual movement called Christian integralism. There's Catholic version of this, Protestant version of this, Orthodox version of this. I don't know if there's Jewish versions of this notable on the right or not, but this is basically the idea of kind of comes out of theological discourse more than political discourse, that politics and religion can never truly be separate. So you have to, right, integrate in some basic way. That's part of the common good right. And just generally, the common good right has kind of rejected the traditional argument, the traditional conservative arguments for limited government. Right? Think of Republican Party talking points for the last 50 years. Limited government has kind of been the central talking point. Whether they actually, right, lived up to that or not is a different question, but it's been the central talking point for a long, long time on conservative discourse. And the common good right has pretty roundly rejected that and argued that we don't need limited government. So I give one quote here. This is from the Harvard law professor, Adrian Vermeule. It says, politics has, quote, the constant aim of giving every man his due. So you can see how that's kind of a rejection of proceduralism, rejection of legalism, and an embrace to the sense that politics ought to always be aiming at a kind of pure sense of what justice requires. Again, with the common good right, free speech is in question, right? The common good right also is very critical of what they call free speech absolutism. They usually don't focus on hate speech, but instead they argue for moral standards on speech, standards based on their conception of social morality and the sort of speech and ideas that would undermine that social morality. They argue should be reasonably within the scope of government control. So long as you have the right moral backing there, free speech can be limited. I will note, of course, that these are not necessarily new divisions. It's not like these just emerged in the last 10 or 15 years, but I do think it's a larger gulf, and the more extreme wings on both sides are more in control of the overall discourse than they have been in the past. And very importantly, and this is more my main interest, is that it's been more intellectualized. The gulf and the distinction here has been more intellectualized. You have more serious academics and social and cultural intellectuals who have given a lot of thought into this question. What does it mean to be on the left? What does it mean to be progressive? What does it mean to be conservative or on the right? And so this division has gotten a lot of serious intellectual play. I will just note in passing that my real interest in this, and if it winds up being a paper that I publish, my main interest is on the common good right. I kind of put the left into this presentation just so it's even-handed and all sides can be skewered by me. But my real intellectual interest is more on what's going on the political right and what has given rise to this common good right. So I do know a little bit more of the details and kind of the intellectual positions that are been staked out by common good thinkers. In case you couldn't tell on the outset, I am not one of them. I'm critical of the common good right. So I'll try and go through this fairly quickly. Michael Oakeshott was a British philosopher. He's a professor of political science at the London School of Economics for almost all of his life. He's well known for being a critic of political rationalism and social planning. So basically, political rationalism is the idea that political questions and political issues, we can know the answers in advance. And politics, the art of politics, is essentially putting those answers into practice. So in other words, we can plan out the kind of society that we think we ought to have, and then we just need to find a way to get it there in practice. So he's a big critic of rationalism, critic of social planning. England in the 1950s was pretty known for embracing a kind of social plan. So Oakeshott was very critical of the UK government for much of his life. The book that I'm focused on is The Politics of Faith and the Politics of Skepticism. This was written in around 1952. It was published posthumously in 1996. So I do realize that I have the slight problem that Oakshott never chose to publish this book. So somebody might argue that maybe he didn't think it was good enough to warrant our attention, but I will just humbly disagree, and lots of other Oakshott scholars disagree on that too. So I think it's a very important book. So I'm just going to ignore that little fact and move on as if it's important. Already mentioned a little bit the idea of faith and skepticism, he says, are two poles around which modern politics is situated. We're always going to be in between those two poles. And it's important as we move on and talk about both faith and skepticism, important to understand that he presented these as kind of frameworks for our frameworks of understanding that operate somewhat under the surface. They're not ideologies themselves. They're not usually self-conscious. He's not saying people go around thinking of themselves as a advocate of the politics of faith or the politics of skepticism, but he says they're just ways of thinking that we have that tend to influence the way we understand government. So they're basic frameworks that operate under the surface. So different kinds of political skeptics might have different particular understandings of politics. They might have support different policies. Certainly, as my presentation will suggest, devotees of the politics of faith can certainly support different policies. I'm going to argue that both the extreme left and the extreme right are both essentially examples of the politics of faith. And of course, they want very, very different societies. So they're not themselves ideologies. And again, he framed this book around the idea that our political vocabulary has been obscured and twisted because, as he says, it's for nearly 5 centuries it has been obliged to serve two masters. And what he means here is the politics of faith and the politics of skepticism, that if we think about different parts of our politics, if we think about different terms, different words, concepts from these different frameworks, we have completely different meanings. So basically, he argued we can't really talk politics, right? When we try to talk politics, when we try to understand differences, when we try to understand where the world is, where it's going, we inevitably lose the thread because we end up talking past each other because we have different meanings of different words. Words like justice, equality, lots of them. You could do a lot of them, and I will talk about some specific terms that I think are appropriate to think about today. Okay, so first, the politics of faith. The politics of faith, Oakshott describes as a belief that the office of government is to direct the activities of its subjects, either so that they contribute to the improvements which in turn converge upon perfection, or so that they conform to the pattern imposed. So elsewhere, he describes government as a kind of inspirer or a director of our pursuit of perfection or improvement. He says, the politics of faith seeks to impose a, quote, a comprehensive pattern on social life. So what exactly this ultimate end is that the politics of faith is aiming towards is going to be different for all sorts of different devotees of it. So he argues there are several examples of what this perfection that the politics of faith is aiming at. He says there are religious versions of it, there are economic versions of it, and there are all sorts of varieties of both of that. The economic version that he focuses most on is the one put forward by Francis Bacon, who basically famously kind of saw the Enlightenment world. He saw these new opportunities in this new world to conquer nature, to provide for man's needs. And he saw politics, especially in that time when political power is being concentrated more at national governments. Technological advancements were in the hands of government. He saw government had this unique capability to order society in such a way that we can conquer the natural world, get the resources that we need for our survival and improvement. The religious versions, you can obviously shouldn't take doesn't take much imagination to see what sort of religious versions you can have. Obviously, right, if there's a belief that a certain moral code, a certain morality is sewn into our nature, is inherently the way we ought to live. The politics of faith is the kind of vehicle by which you can put that into place. Right? You can require people to conform to the certain pattern imposed. He notes, right, the word perfection here. He uses this word perfection all the time. He says perfection doesn't necessarily mean literal perfection, but it means that we have a single road that we know that we need to travel on. So the politics of faith doesn't necessarily have to be utopian in the sense that it believes that a absolutely perfect, flawless society is just around the corner. But the politics of faith always argues that we know the direction we need to be going, that there's a single road that we should be traveling, and that the role of government is to make sure we're all getting on that road and traveling it as quickly as possible. The politics of faith then emerged in the modern world. He says this is something ancient and medieval world didn't really have any conception of this because they didn't have the capability of even fathoming this view of government. Circumstances and capabilities allowed for it. Technological advances made the idea that a governor, a legislature could actually direct all of society. It made that thinkable. Whereas in the ancient and medieval world, there just wasn't the technology there. You certainly had plenty of people who would love to be able to just direct society towards whatever vision they wanted, but they didn't have the capacity of monitoring people and enforcing people or enforcing the rules that they would impose. So as the modern world, as technology advanced, and as political power concentrated, as the power of nobility and kind of feudal estates faded away, and you had more first the rule of absolute monarchs, and then democratic legislatures, this became thinkable. So he really described it as a purely modern thing. And because of that technological advances in those circumstances, the politics of faith then understands governing as an unlimited activity and government as omnicompetent. So what that means is that there's no sphere of life that is inherently outside of the purview of government. Right? The actions that we take as individuals or as civic groups are always going to have an impact on the whole. Right? So in that, ever entirely private. Right? Everything we do, we think, we say has some sort of impact. And then when you put that, when you kind of apply that general idea across all of society, the things that everybody says, the things that everybody does are always going to have an impact on the whole. So the politics of faith understands then if the role of government is to direct that whole, to shape that whole, you can't simply say that anything is purely private, right? So it tends to dissolve the distinction between public and private spheres, right? Omnicompetent, there's right, everything is within their purview. And accordingly, especially with the religious versions of perfection, he says, dissent and disobedience will be punished not as troublesome conduct, but as error and as sin. So again, you get the sense if we know the direction society needs to take, and you are actively working against it, right? You're not just a troublemaker, right? You are a traitor. Right? You are fundamentally unjust in important ways. A good quote he has on this, he says, "It will be proper for an activity of governing wedded to the enterprise of perfection to require not merely obedience or submission from the subject, but approval and even love." So the government doesn't just require that you be obedient and submit to their rules, but they want your love, your active approval. The politics of skepticism then, in part, he says the politics of skepticism emerged as a response to the politics of faith, but in part, he says it just emerged as a response to the conditions that made the politics of faith possible. So when when technological advances moved forward and centralization of government power moved forward to such an extent that these sorts of faith projects could be conceived, some people embrace that as a kind of positive thing, as an optimistic endeavor, like Bacon, and other people saw it as a danger, right? And in some ways, he says that's the kind of fundamental crux of the politics of faith. When you see the concentration of government power and the advances of technology and all the things that we can do today that we never could before, do you see that as a positive thing or a negative thing? Do you focus on the possibilities of what a society can accomplish when it is directed towards some aim, or do you focus on the dangers of that? So the politics of skepticism, as you might imagine, focused on the dangers. Skepticism sees the office of government is meant to maintain and improve, quote, a system of rights and duties and the concomitant system of means of redress, which compose the social order. So in other words, simply having, maintaining, and enforcing a basic system of rights that constitutes a basic social order. He says, so other ways of thinking this are that politics is primarily a judicial activity. Now, by this, what he means is not that you only have courts. Obviously, you're going to have legislatures and executives, but what he means is that whether it's legislatures, executives, judges, their ultimate goal, the ultimate goal of the polity should be to have a known system of order that is disseminated, that is enforced, and that is adjusted as needed to preserve basic social order. So in other ways, you can see how this is in direct response to the politics of faith. It is not the imposition of a single moral order or other direction, tone, or manner upon the activities of its subjects. There's a big emphasis in the politics of skepticism on formalism or proceduralism. That we have, thinking about it in terms of the judicial spheres is very useful. Right? We have formal protections of people who have been charged with crimes that might or might not always be conducive to making sure that the guilty are punished. So if you suggest, right, does justice require that the guilty be punished? The formal and procedural limits that we have in our judicial system don't always get us there, right? They might, in fact, make it so that the guilty person is not punished. But we would still say in that case that just in one sense, we would say justice has been done, right? If we go through the correct process, through all the very formal procedures and have all the formal protections. Where do the rules come from then? Right? If government is there to maintain a system of rights and duties, essentially a system of rules, where do they come from? Well, he says this on that. He says, this sort of political order will always be conditioned by the sort of activities which the members of the community are engaged in. In other words, the rules are going to be a kind of politic balance of the views of society as a whole. They're not going to be preconceived, right? That you can't sit down and say, these are what the rules of society must be. Instead, you have to govern a particular society that lives in particular ways and create the rules around the ways that society tends to operate. So it's in this sense, and really in this sense alone, Oakshott is often described as a conservative, in that he argues the rules of society should be derived from the activities and the behavior and the views of society as a whole. Now, he's not a majoritarian at all. That doesn't mean 50% plus one. It means the kind of political balancing and compromise that usually takes place with the establishment of any system of rules. In other words, the politics of skepticism says we don't have the answers beforehand. We have to go through the process of self-government in order to determine what the rules of society are going to be. Hopefully that makes sense. Politics of skepticism then is going to be very nervous about the exercise of political power. And he says the skeptic is not disposed to forget that the office of government is occupied by the men of the same make as the subjects they rule. So in other words, if we need government to corral us rowdy citizens, we have every reason to believe that those who are governing also are going to need to be corralled and limited. Since I am, as predicted, somewhat behind, I'm not going to talk about the misalliance with theories of natural right, even though that is a very interesting topic, but it would make me go far over my time limit. So I will also go fairly quickly through this because I'm hoping that the way I set up all this presentation, the connection between the politics of faith and the emerging wings of both the ideological left and right should be somewhat straightforward. I will say at the outset, the American left, I think, is more naturally inclined towards faith and somewhat restrained by skepticism. You can go back to the early workings of like the social gospel movement in the late 19th century, early progressivism. Woodrow Wilson, it would be one of the most obvious examples of a kind of politics of faith. And a lot of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal speeches, a lot of the same way. Whereas the American right, I think, is more naturally inclined towards skepticism, but always has forces pulling it toward faith. The right's arguments about limited government and property rights and these sorts of things have always had a very procedural character to them. But there have always been forces like moral majority movement in the 1980s or things like that have kind of pulled the right in the direction of faith. That, well, let's use government in a particular way to seek after particular aims. On the thinking about the kind of new left, right, the woke left, faith emerges in this emphasis on remaking structural social structures, right? Remaking any sense of kind of tearing down and rebuilding is always going to be, for Oakeshott, an example of the politics of faith. Remaking, restructuring political and social order around an ideal understanding of equality or social justice oftentimes suggests that we know the correct answer. It's a matter of kind of restructuring society in the right directions. A lot of new moral understandings of equality, i.e. non-material understandings of equality that differentiate the new left that's emerging today with, say, the Bernie Sanders socialist types from like 1970s and 1980s that were very much old school socialists, primarily focused on economic class, economic well-being. The new right, much more interested in different conceptions of equality that's kind of surround personal identity, which more so than kind of the old Bernie Sanders socialist, I think requires entry into more areas of life, right? If you're focused on a version of equality, it's purely economic. It primarily requires a government that engages in the economic spheres of life. Once you go beyond economics and start talking more about the human person, that I think offers more entryways for government to go into different areas of life. The common good right, a lot of times they use the language that politics is a means to attain, quote, the highest good. Nothing could be more exemplary of the politics of faith than that. The common good constitutionalism argues that the law is meant to create a society in which people can live fulfilling, moral, upright lives that gives them the highest human, that gives them access to the highest human capability. So that's very much part of the politics of faith. The rejection of legal proceduralism, textualism, constitutional originalism are classic markers, I think, of the politics of faith. These things, again, they often argue these things are morally empty because they don't necessarily get you the right moral answer. And there's often a very explicitly religious character to the common good right that fuses religious understanding into the law and into governance in a very direct way, not simply in the idea that people of religious faith can and should be part of government. That would not qualify, I think, as the politics of faith, but that the law has to have an ultimate kind of religious backing and an ultimate moral backing based in religion. One thing I'll note, both of them often play on what Oakeshott called a quasi-skeptical argument. that non-governmental concentrations of power require governmental concentration of power to counteract. So in other words, if you don't concentrate government, or if you don't concentrate power in government to create the kind of society that is right, other actors, non-governmental actors, will do that. So that's kind of the basis of critical theory, is the idea that the sum action, the activity of societies, individuals, groups, organizations, businesses create social structures that are good or bad. So why would we possibly want that versus one that's consciously decided on the part of government? Same thing with common good conservatism. You often see this with, they like the idea of regulating tech companies and social media companies and that sort of thing. Why? Is because they say better to have an empowered government that redirects these entities towards a higher moral good than to just live with the order that society would create on its own. So it's interesting that that's really prominent in today's discourse, especially on the right. So it's very interesting. Oakshott specifically foresaw that or identified that in the 1950s, that you see the idea that if you see concentrations of power outside of government, well, we need to have a kind of politics of faith that can have a vision to redirect those other concentrations of power. I've had a little bit more to say on the free speech issue, but again, for time's sake, I will move on. Also have two examples on both the left and the right of I think, substantial quotes that reflect the concept of the politics of faith in the left and the right. I will let you look at those on the YouTube stream for the sake of time. So I'll move on then. I'll talk a little bit about our political vocabulary today. In what ways does this, do these two frameworks, the politics of faith and skepticism, distort our political vocabulary and prevent us from having intelligent conversations about politics and government? Right. We share the vocabulary, is what Oakshott argues. We share the vocabulary, we share the words, we use the same terms very often, but we just mean different things by them. So he uses an example, salus populi suprema lex esto, which basically means the good of the people is the supreme law, which is a phrase found in Cicero. And he basically shows how you can understand that in literally as both a statement for political faith and political skepticism. I'm not going to walk through the Latin on all that because, again, time. But I will talk about some of our contemporary words. Liberal. The word liberal, of course, is, I still remember teaching Intro to Political Philosophy and trying to, in vain, convey the various senses that the word liberal has. We use it as a kind of partisan word, right? He's a liberal Democrat or something like that. But it's always had for decades and centuries, really, I mean, over a century at least, it's had a much broader sense of just a form of government that has fundamental limits to it, that sees government as something that has outer limits of what it is allowed to do. Within that broader category of liberal, of course, there are different varieties, but liberal is one of the words that today is being is very difficult. So on the common good right side, there's been a conscious movement to reject liberalism, and what I mean that is not reject the partisan liberalism as in liberal Democrats, right? But reject liberalism more broadly, reject the idea that government is a fundamentally distinct category, has a fundamentally distinct role to play in human life. So there is a very popular book published in 2018 by a Notre Dame political theorist named Patrick Deneen that was titled "Why Liberalism Failed." Has been very influential in conservative circles. And he's not talking about 1960s liberalism. He's talking about the liberalism going back to the Enlightenment, of John Locke and others. Well, liberalism can be two things, I would argue. This broad liberalism can be two things. It can be an established practice, or it can be a kind of moral imperative. And the politics of skepticism would argue that liberalism is an established practice, so that for hundreds of years, especially in Western Europe, but elsewhere too, we've had governments that slowly and gradually developed restraints on power that kind of grew out of society's practice, grew out of society's tensions that worked their ways out. So you look at Great Britain and what it went through in the English Civil War, and then in the Glorious Revolution, and then in its engagement with the American colonies. There were all sorts of adjustments that were made that gradually restrained government until at a certain point you have what you might consider a liberal government. And in that sense, liberalism is just a practice. Liberalism is just something that has happened, and it's broadly, I think, a pretty salutary thing. But you can also see liberalism as a kind of moral imperative. So here's where you read John Locke's vision of theories of natural rights. You read a kind of utilitarian example, which is not strictly moral, but frankly, there's a moral underpinning in people like John Stuart Mill that they just don't like to admit, that kind of says, hey, there are moral imperatives that government must be a particular way, that society must be a particular way, that have also come to be seen as liberal, and that is essentially the liberalism of politics of faith. So as we talk about today, or the idea of liberalism, whether a particular movement is illiberal or not, whether liberalism has failed, as some have argued, right? The word liberalism can have at least these two different meanings, that the distinction between these two is often lost. And when someone tries to attack, say, the concept of liberalism as a moral imperative, they often also attack the idea of liberalism as simply an established practice, just the very idea that we should have a government of limits. I'm not going to talk about neutrality to save time. Justice is the other one I'm going to talk about. So the distinction that Oakshott makes a lot of is a very old one between use and lex. Use, J-U-S, and lex, L-E-X, the Latin terms. Use has this sense of absolute justice. The economist and political commentator Thomas Sowell makes a distinction between cosmic justice and I can't remember his other side of it, but basically procedural justice versus cosmic justice. So oftentimes we talk about justice, we say we want a just society, we have various visions of the just society, but those coming from different frameworks have fundamentally different visions of what justice even means, because in some cases justice means having a set of rules that everybody knows, that everybody's equally required to abide by, protections that everybody has in common, and applying them on an equal footing. Whereas others often have a kind of cosmic sense of what justice requires. That, right, going back to the Vermeulen quote that I said earlier, right, that the goal of politics is to always be trying to give every man his due, or every person his due. That is a sense of cosmic justice or use. So in many ways, our discussions of justice mix up the conception of use and lex, between just the procedural law that we have and this kind of cosmic desire for justice. And sometimes we fail, I think, to recognize the extent to which the pursuit of cosmic justice, the pursuit of use, might inadvertently or intentionally upset the rule of lex, or the rule of law, which are the procedural protections that in reality probably give us most of the good things that the legal system provides. Time again, I won't go through equality, and I won't go through this either. The case for political skepticism, I will just say one final word on the case for political skepticism, why I think skepticism is attractive. One is that Oakeshott says we're always searching for a, quote, a habitable middle region between the extremes of faith and skepticism. And that in the modern world, that would mean advocating more for skepticism, because the modern world is designed to give the politics of faith the upper hand. And I would say that our modern technology, especially social media and communication stuff, gives the politics of faith even more of an upper hand, because you can convey these grand messages of what society could be in really vivid terms. And then finally, I would just say, right, the case for political skepticism, that I'd say skepticism is a kind of necessary corollary to peaceful self-government, because, as I've kind of stressed as time has gone through, it assumes that the right answers are not predetermined. Self-government tends to really fail, and tends to not even be seen as a good thing when you assume that we have all the right answers already, that I can kind of get the right answers in my own mind. because why go through all the messiness, all the compromise, all of that self-government entails if I know I have the right answer? So self-government works when we assume we don't have the right answer and that we're trying to figure it out through those processes. And when we universally lose that sense, we gradually lose the very underpinnings of self-government itself. So with that, I apologize that I took too long and I went over and I didn't even get to say everything I wanted to say, but I will.
Oh no, that was excellent. Let's see. Let me see if I
Okay,
can
I'll stop my share here.
There we go. All right. So if anybody has any questions, please be sure to leave them here in the chat, and we'll try to ask those real quick. We went a little long on time, but that's I think the talk as a whole is very interesting. So the one question that we do have is either of the two political philosophies more supportive of or allied to capitalism?
Would you, the two political philosophies, meaning faith and skepticism?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah. No. Well, yes, but both of them can be. That's one of the points I had to skip over, is that these two frameworks you can often have certain policies that you could defend from either framework. They're not really an ideology in the sense that they don't have any kind of comprehensive answer to what sort of policy should we have, what sort of particular rules should there be. It's why are we doing it is the question. So capitalism, right? Francis Bacon, very, very associated with capitalism, right? Capitalism, you can have this sense that capitalism is bringing us towards a bold new future. So the defense of capitalism that comes from, look at all the technological innovation, look at how we can extend human life, look at the incredible advances in standards of living. Those would mostly be the kinds of arguments you would find from the politics of faith. But capitalism can also be defended on from the perspective of the politics of skepticism too, in the sense that capitalism is kind of saying, look, we probably don't have the capability to order economic life in a productive way, that if we try to do it, we'll probably fail and might screw things up much more than they were before. And so probably best in most cases to just, let market forces be at work and do what they do. And only step in here and there if there are significant failures in the market. So in that sense, it would be a skeptical defense. So that's actually a really good example of something I had to skip over for time. That no, it's not universally affiliated with either one. Especially when you get questions like what sorts of rules should society have and what sorts of rules is a society going to create for itself. You have a lot of times there can be overlap there where people will create rules for skeptical reasons. Other people will agree to those same rules because they think they will bring us to some sort of great fulfillment.
Okay, looks like we have another question here in the chat. Would you say that the lack of vocabulary or different vocabulary plays a huge role in some of the disagreement in politics between the right and left?
Between the right and left. Okay, so I mean, most of my focus has been on kind of within. And again, I had to breeze over that pretty quickly, but so most of my focus has been on when the more extreme versions of left and the moderate versions of the left kind of talk to one another and vice versa on the right. I think the vocabulary gets in, it gets in the way. But no, I think it definitely contributes to disagreements between left and right too, or I would say maybe not necessarily disagreements, but contributes to a lack of communication and a lack of serious discussion. So there are all sorts of reasons as to why we can't productively talk politics. But one of them I do think is that a lot of these concepts that we use, we have different understandings of it. So the one I had to skip over was equality. I mean, justice is one. I talked a little bit about justice. But equality is another one, right? In that you have different understandings of equality, equality before the law. If we have a society in which everybody equally lives under the same rules, has all of the same legal protections, is that a fundamentally equal society? Some would say, yeah, that's an equal society. That is the sort of equality that a democratic society ought to aim towards. Others would say, well, no, you have to go farther. You have to look at things like socioeconomic status. If you have significant disparities between rich and poor, does that constitute an unequal society? And then you can go even deeper than that and say even beyond economics, right? Are there kind of fundamental questions of human identity that kind of differentiate between people, that people have a better way of getting through life than other people do, and that makes for a fundamentally unequal society? So that would be a sense in which the faith version of equality would be very much in tension with the skeptical version. So yeah, I think it contributes.
So I've got one last question for you, and it's a little bit of a so what question, but
okay,
what do you do with this now? Like,
is there in that business?
Yeah, well, is there anything in Oakeshott even that's maybe predictive of, well, if society is structured in such a way that this is what we predict might happen, or is there anything that the common man can use with this and learn and think about how to maybe better communicate with the other side and even within their fellow party mates?
Yeah, I mean, he was notable for not ever having any kind of broad prescriptions for what do you do. He was very much the type of person that studied to just try to understand the world, and I'm not going to give you a prescription. But certainly he was a big advocate of a particular vision of liberal education that he had, that he laid out in a lot of stuff. And education was the key, I think, in that if people are more aware of what they're saying, more aware of the various strands of thought that have been passed down for centuries, developed over centuries, more aware of how they have contributed to our understanding of certain words and certain political concepts, it's going to help, right? It's going to, you can help. I mean, just the kind of identifying, hey, I recognize that this particular word has 2 or 3 different distinct meanings, is a start to kind of say, I realize somebody else has a different conception of what equality means, and you can at least understand that conception, and you can understand it as the kind of intellectual descendant of a particular tradition of thinking, and so that's helpful. I mean, it's not gonna paper over disagreements. I mean, there are significant disagreements. Faith and skepticism point in different directions, and so there will always be those. But at the very least, yeah, I think it could help communication.
Well, this reminds me of way back in the day. I taught an undergrad political science 101 course, and had an article that followed pretty closely with the kinds of things you're saying about different vocabularies, different meanings. And we read this article, and a student came up to me after class, and we were talking about this article that we read, and I thought, I don't know if I'm going to use this thing in the future. And he said, no, absolutely. Like, you've got to keep this one in here, because I've never even considered that we're not talking about the same things necessarily when we're thinking about our broader goals in politics. So I kept it in, but it was a hard read. But it's interesting to think about. I'm going to give you an opportunity for a shameless plug here. If we want to follow you and see your work, what all can we do? And maybe can you tell us a little bit about your online magazine?
Yeah, I mean, Law and Liberty is an online magazine. www.lawliberty.org. We are on the conservative side of things, but we are not red meat partisans. So if you either share our inclinations or are open to hearing reasonable discourse with which you disagree, you can check us out there. I'm on Twitter. I mainly just retweet Law and Liberty articles, and every now and again other stuff that's good. But I am on Twitter. You can look me up there. It's John G. Grove 1, or at John G. Grove 1.
Awesome.
But I am not.